Get him out of my row.
I didn't pay $11,000 to sit next to someone like him. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. First class is fully booked. There isn't another seat available.
The words carried clean across the first-class cabin before the door had even shut, and half the row turned to look. Grace Whitmore said it loud enough for everyone to hear, without lowering her voice, without a flicker of hesitation. The way people speak when they've never once in their life expected to be told no. The man beside her didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the window and let it pass over him like weather. Nobody on that plane knew who he actually was. Nobody knew what was about to happen 4 hours later, at the gate, in front of every single person who had laughed along. Would Grace Whitmore have said a word of it if she'd known? Before we get into it, where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. The first thing anyone at Sterling Air ever noticed about Caleb Marsh, on the rare occasion they noticed him at all, was that he did not act like a man worth noticing. He boarded Flight 214 out of Denver in the second group, the way most economy-adjacent first-class passengers did, apologizing to a woman in the aisle as he lifted a worn canvas duffel into the overhead bin. He wore a plain button-down that had clearly been ironed in a hurry, the collar slightly crooked, and a pair of sneakers that had seen a few too many winters. He said thank you to the gate agent by name, because her badge was visible and he had a habit, an old one, of using people's names when he could. He said good morning to the woman in seat 2A beside him. She did not say it back. Grace Whitmore was 52 years old, and had spent 9 of those years as chief executive of Halworth Consumer Goods, a company with a headquarters on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan tower, a driver who idled outside that building every evening at exactly 6:15, whether she needed him or not, and a habit so old it no longer registered to her as a habit at all. The habit of assuming every space she entered existed, structurally, to accommodate her. She flew first class on Sterling Air something like 40 times a year, mostly this exact Denver-New York route, ferrying between Halworth's manufacturing partners in the Midwest and its headquarters on the East Coast. She believed, with the total unexamined certainty of a woman who had never once been meaningfully contradicted, that $11,000 bought her more than a seat. It bought her, in her mind, the right to decide who else was permitted to occupy the seat beside it. She noticed Caleb the moment the duffel bag thudded softly against the overhead bin ceiling, and something in her expression curdled before he had even finished sitting down. It wasn't any one specific thing. It was the sneakers. It was the slightly wrinkled collar. It was the way Caleb had said thank you to the gate agent like her job mattered to him, which struck Grace, in some inarticulate corner of her mind, as the behavior of someone unaccustomed to being served, someone who didn't quite belong in a cabin where service was simply assumed, not appreciated. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude somewhere over Nebraska, Grace had decided she'd had enough of it. She pressed the call button when the flight attendant leaned in. A woman named Renata Kowalski, who had worked for Sterling Air for 9 years and had developed, over the course of those 9 years, a very specific and very tired kind of patience for exactly this type of passenger. Grace said it loud enough for the entire front cabin to hear. Get him out of my row. I didn't pay $11,000 to sit next to someone like him. Renata kept her face neutral, the way her training and 9 years of experience had taught her to. She told Ms. Whitmore that first class was fully booked and there was nowhere else to reseat anyone. Grace's jaw tightened. She said, a little louder this time, that she was certain something could be arranged for a passenger of her standing, and that perhaps the man beside her, she gestured at Caleb without looking at him directly, the way you gesture at an inconvenient piece of furniture, could be moved somewhere less visible, somewhere he wouldn't be an inconvenience to paying customers. Caleb still hadn't said a word. He kept his eyes on the wing catching the thin afternoon light, his jaw relaxed, his hands folded in his lap. A man across the aisle in 3A, a retired teacher named Warren Cole, on his way to visit his grandchildren, watched the entire exchange with his jaw set tight and said nothing. because he had learned a long time ago in his professional life that intervening with a woman like Grace Whitmore rarely changed anything except who she decided to be angry at next. Renata apologized to Grace for the inconvenience, not because she believed her owed one, but because de-escalation was, quite literally, in her job description, and moved on to service the next row. Grace spent the rest of the flight making her displeasure known in 100 small, deliberate ways. She sighed audibly every time Caleb shifted his weight. She asked Renata twice more, at careful 15-minute intervals, whether anything had opened up. She angled her entire body toward the aisle, as though physical distance from Caleb might communicate something Caleb was apparently too dense to absorb on his own. Somewhere over Ohio, she muttered just loud enough to be heard, never quite loud enough to be undeniable, that some people really shouldn't be flying first class at all if they couldn't be bothered to look like they belonged there. Caleb heard every word of it. He said nothing. He had decided a long time ago, the way people do who have spent years being underestimated by people who assumed the worst of them on sight, that his energy was better spent almost anywhere else than convincing a stranger on an airplane that he deserved basic decency. The plane landed at 6:50 p.m. Eastern, as the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin filled with the low shuffle of passengers reaching for overhead bags. The cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out into the aisle, as he did on most flights, to thank passengers as they deplaned. Captain Frank Delacroix was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, who had flown for Sterling Air for over 2 decades, the kind of captain who remembered names, and asked about connecting flights out of genuine habit rather than performance. He made his way down the aisle, nodding to a few familiar faces until he reached row 2. He stopped. He looked at Caleb, and something in his posture shifted immediately into something warmer, more familiar, the recognition of a man greeting someone he'd met before in a very different context. "Mr. Marsh," Captain Delacroix said, extending a hand. "Didn't know you were on this one today. Good to have you aboard, sir. Hope the flight treated you all right." Grace Whitmore, half out of her seat, briefcase already in hand, froze completely. "Sir." The word landed strangely in the cabin, the way certain words do when they arrive in a context that simply doesn't fit them. Grace looked at the captain. She looked at Caleb, at the wrinkled collar, at the worn duffel bag now slung over one shoulder, and something in her own expression cracked open, the first small fracture in an assumption she had not examined once in the entire 4-hour flight. She asked before she could stop herself, in a voice that had already lost most of its certainty, what exactly the captain meant by that. Captain Delacroix glanced at Grace, then back at Caleb, with the faint, easy smile of a man who had absolutely no idea what he had just detonated. "This is Caleb Marsh," he said, as though it were the most natural sentence in the world. "He owns the airline." Nobody in row 2 moved for a full second. Somewhere behind them, a flight attendant kept repeating, "Watch your step, folks, watch your step," on autopilot, entirely unaware that the front of the cabin had gone completely still. Grace Whitmore did not immediately understand what she was hearing, because understanding it required dismantling 4 hours of certainty in real time, and certainty like hers did not dismantle easily. She said the word "owns" quietly, almost to herself, the way you test a word you've heard but cannot yet place in context. Caleb Marsh had bought a controlling stake in Sterling Air 18 months earlier, at 30 years old, in a deal that had generated a modest amount of trade press coverage, and then quietly disappeared from public attention, the way most infrastructure and transportation acquisitions do unless something eventually goes wrong. Before that, he'd spent 6 years building, and then selling a logistics optimization company that most people outside the freight and aviation industries had never heard of, for a sum large enough that he genuinely never needed to work again, let alone fly commercial in whatever seat happened to be available on any given Tuesday. He flew Sterling Air the way he had flown it that day, economy or first class depending on what was open, alone in the plainest clothes he owned, without an assistant, without any of the trappings that typically announce a person's importance to a room. Nobody on any given flight ever knew who he was unless, like today, a captain who had met him twice at a shareholder briefing happened to recognize his face. He did it on purpose, not as a stunt, and not as some elaborate secret test designed to catch anyone in the act of bad behavior. He genuinely, simply wanted to know what his own airline felt like from a passenger's seat, without the distortion that inevitably comes from people knowing they're being watched by the person who signs the checks. He wanted to know whether the boarding process actually worked the way the quarterly operations reports claimed it did. He wanted to know whether flight attendants like Renata were genuinely supported when a passenger escalated, or whether they were simply absorbing the emotional cost of de-escalation alone, with no real backup from the company that employed them. He had never expected an answer this specific. He had never expected to spend 4 hours being told, in front of a full first-class cabin, that he didn't belong in the seat he'd paid for. Grace's face moved through several distinct shades of color before she found something to say. I didn't realize, she started, and then stopped, because there was no version of that sentence that led anywhere useful. Caleb finished gathering his bag and looked up at her, not with fury, and not with the satisfaction of a man who had spent the entire flight quietly waiting for this exact reversal, but with something closer to mild, tired patience, the specific expression of a man who has had some version of this conversation more times than he can count, just never with quite this level of irony attached to it. "You didn't need to realize anything," Caleb said, quietly enough that it didn't carry the way Grace's insults had carried. "You just needed to not say it in the first place." He thanked Captain Delacroix by name and walked off the plane. He did not ask for Grace's name. He did not, in that moment, do anything at all with the knowledge that the woman beside him for 4 hours ran a consumer goods company that happened to be one of Sterling Air's largest corporate accounts, worth close to $2 million a year in business travel spent across the fleet. He simply walked up the jet bridge, thanked the gate agent again by name on his way past, and disappeared into the terminal. What Grace Whitmore did not understand, standing frozen in the aisle with her briefcase half raised, was that this was not the end of anything. It was, in a far quieter and less theatrical sense than she might have imagined, only the beginning of something that would take 3 full weeks to fully surface, because Caleb Marsh had learned a long time ago, in 6 years of building a company from nothing, that the loudest possible reaction is almost never the most useful one, and that real accountability requires patience rather than a scene. He didn't report the incident to anyone at Sterling Air that night. He went home to his apartment overlooking the river, and he sat with it for a while, not with anger exactly, but with the particular, focused curiosity of a man who had just been handed a piece of information about his own company that no earnings report or customer satisfaction survey would ever have surfaced on its own. Because the longer he turned the flight over in his mind, the more he understood that the moment on the plane wasn't really about him at all. It was about Renata and every flight attendant like her across Sterling's entire fleet, who had to absorb a passenger's open contempt with a fixed professional smile, because company policy gave them no meaningful mechanism to push back. It was about a customer, a corporate account, specifically, who apparently believed her spending gave her license to treat airline staff and fellow passengers however she pleased, and who had likely never once, in 9 years of flying this same route 40 times a year, been told otherwise. Because nobody inside Sterling Air had ever had the standing to tell a client worth $2 million annually that her behavior was a genuine problem. Caleb had built and sold a company before. He understood from long professional experience that behavior like Grace's almost never happened in isolation. A woman who says what Grace said, on a plane full of strangers, in front of a flight attendant she'd never met. Has almost certainly said versions of it before, to people with far less power to do anything meaningful about it than a random passenger in seat 2B who happened, invisibly, to own the entire airline. So the next morning, he asked his assistant to quietly pull two things: Sterling Air's internal customer conduct reports for the previous 2 years, cross-referenced specifically against the Halworth Consumer Goods corporate travel account, and a separate, informal inquiry to Sterling's in-flight services and human resources departments, asking whether any crew members had ever logged complaints, formal or otherwise, about passenger behavior on flights booked under that account. What came back over the following several days told him considerably more than he'd expected. There were 6 prior documented incidents involving Grace Whitmore specifically, spanning roughly 18 months. None of them had ever been formally escalated. All 6 existed only as informal notes buried in individual crew logs, the kind of record that never reaches anyone with real institutional authority. Because the flight attendants involved had learned, the way service employees so often learn, that filing an official complaint against a client representing a $2 million annual account tended to generate far more scrutiny of the employee than of the passenger who'd caused the problem. In the first place, one flight attendant, a woman named Priya Anand who had been with Sterling for 6 years, had been quietly reassigned off her preferred Denver-New York route after Grace complained she'd been too familiar with her, simply for asking, per standard protocol, whether she had any dietary restrictions before meal service. Another attendant, a young man named Dominic Reyes in his 2nd year with the airline, had received a formal verbal warning in his file after Grace claimed he'd been rude during a ground delay that Grace herself had caused by boarding 15 minutes late while finishing a phone call. In the jet bridge, a third note, buried and never acted upon by anyone, described a passenger, unnamed in the note itself. But the flight number and date matched precisely, demanding that a family traveling with a crying infant be moved to an entirely different flight at their own expense, so that she wouldn't have to deal with it. None of it had ever reached a level where anyone with genuine authority looked at the pattern as a whole rather than as a series of isolated, unconnected inconveniences. Each incident had simply been absorbed by whichever employee happened to be standing closest, because Grace Whitmore represented revenue, and revenue, under the ordinary structure of Sterling Air before Caleb had bought it, had always quietly outranked the basic dignity of the people who actually kept the planes running on time. Caleb sat with all of that for a while. He thought about Renata's expression on the flight, not angry, not even particularly surprised, just tired in a specific, well-practiced way that told him unmistakably this wasn't new territory for her. He thought about Priya Anand, moved off a route she'd apparently liked, for the crime of asking a standard question. He did not want revenge. He was fairly certain, even that first week, that revenge wasn't actually the point here, and that a company built around punishing one rude passenger, however satisfying that might feel in the moment, would learn precisely the wrong lesson from the whole situation. But he did want the truth to surface, not about Grace specifically, but about a deeper system inside his own airline that had quietly taught its employees, for years, that certain customers were simply too valuable to ever be held accountable. He started deliberately small. He asked Renata, through an anonymized internal channel that didn't reveal who was asking, what would have actually helped her in that specific moment on Flight 214, beyond simply having Grace removed from the plane. Her answer when it came back through the intermediary was simple and direct. She hadn't needed anyone fired. She'd needed to know that reporting the incident wouldn't cost her more, professionally, than simply staying quiet and absorbing it had. That single answer became the entire foundation of everything Caleb built afterward. 3 weeks after the flight, Halworth Consumer Goods Corporate Travel Department received a routine-looking meeting request from Sterling Air's account management team. The kind of quarterly relationship check in that happens, as a matter of course, between an airline and its major corporate clients. Grace Whitmore, as CEO, wasn't typically looped into these meetings personally. They were normally handled by her travel coordinator and a mid-level account manager on Sterling's side. But this particular request specified, politely but unambiguously, that Ms. Whitmore's own presence was required. She arrived at Sterling Air's downtown offices on a Thursday afternoon, mildly irritated at the interruption to a schedule already packed with a board call and 2 investor meetings. Expecting a fairly standard conversation about volume discounts or possibly an upcoming change to Sterling's Midwest route map. She was shown into a conference room on the 11th floor, and it took her a full 3 seconds after the door opened to recognize the man sitting at the head of the table in a plain gray sweater. A laptop open in front of him, a cup of coffee from the building's own ground floor cafe sitting beside it. Caleb Marsh did not stand when Grace walked in. He gestured to the empty seat across the table and waited until she had sat down, visibly rattled now, the full recognition setting in before he spoke. "I wanted to have this conversation privately," Caleb said, "rather than in front of your team or mine. I thought that was fair given what happened." Grace started to say something, an apology half-formed. The kind of thing people say when they're desperately trying to get ahead of a conversation they can already sense is heading somewhere they don't want it to go. Caleb held up a hand, not unkindly, and told her this conversation wasn't really about the flight itself, not directly. He turned his laptop screen around. On it was a summary. 6 incidents, dates, flight numbers, brief anonymized descriptions of each, and beside every one, a note about exactly how it had been handled internally, or, more precisely, how it hadn't been. Grace read it in complete silence. Her face moved through the same slow sequence of colors it had gone through in the aisle of Flight 214 3 weeks earlier. Caleb explained, plainly and without any theatrical buildup, that Sterling Air genuinely valued Halworth's business, and that this meeting was not about ending the relationship. And it certainly wasn't about making some kind of public example out of her. What it was actually about, he said, was a pattern, not only of Grace's own individual behavior, though that was certainly part of it, but of a broader culture inside Caleb's own airline that had spent years quietly training its frontline employees to absorb mistreatment from certain passengers. Because the revenue those passengers represented had made them feel functionally untouchable. "I'm not here to punish you for what you said to me," Caleb said. "I want to be very clear about that part. I'm here because you said it in front of a flight attendant who's dealt with some version of the same thing from you at least 6 times over 18 months, and who never once had the institutional standing to tell you it wasn't acceptable. That's not really your failure, if I'm honest with you. That one's mine. I own the company that let all of that happen unchecked." Grace sat with that for a long, heavy moment. Something in her posture had visibly shifted since she'd walked into the room. The reflexive confidence of a woman who had spent 9 years assuming every space adjusted itself automatically around her head. For what was possibly the first time in longer than she could remember, simply gone quiet. She asked eventually, in a voice considerably smaller than the one she'd used at 35,000 feet, what exactly Caleb intended to do about all of it. Caleb told her 2 specific things. First, that Halworth's account with Sterling Air would continue exactly as it stood, because the underlying business relationship had nothing to do with any of this personally. And punishing an entire company's travel budget for the behavior of one executive would only end up hurting employees on both sides who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Second, that he was implementing a new, formal escalation protocol across the entire airline, one that gave every flight attendant and gate agent a clear, protected channel to report passenger conduct issues, with an explicit guarantee that doing so would never again cost them their preferred routes or their standing with the company, regardless of how much revenue the passenger in question happened to represent. "You'll keep flying with us," Caleb said, "but you should know that the next flight attendant who tells you your behavior is a problem isn't going to get quietly moved to a worse route for saying it. She's going to be heard, and it's going to be documented properly, and it's going to matter. That's really the only thing that's actually changing here." Grace didn't say much else in that meeting. She apologized, genuinely, as far as Caleb could tell, though he had long since learned not to weigh apologies too heavily against what a person actually did with themselves afterward. She left the building considerably quieter than she'd arrived, and considerably smaller in her own estimation than she had been in a very long time. The changes at Sterling Air rolled out gradually over the following 2 months, without any public announcement, without a press release, without any of the performative fanfare that so often accompanies corporate culture initiatives. It happened the ordinary, unglamorous way real institutional change usually happens. New incident reporting software distributed to every in-flight crew member. A direct escalation line from cabin staff straight to a review board that sat entirely outside the sales and account management chain. And a mandatory institutional review triggered automatically by any passenger conduct pattern crossing 3 or more logged incidents, regardless of the size or value of the account attached to that passenger's name. Renata Kowalski was one of the very first people consulted when the new protocol was being drafted, specifically because Caleb had remembered her face on that flight and wanted to hear directly from her, unfiltered, what would have actually made a real difference in that moment. Her answer became, more or less word for word, the guiding principle written into Sterling Air's new formal conduct policy. Reporting a problem should never cost an employee more than staying silent about it did. Priya Anand, the attendant who'd been quietly reassigned off her preferred route 18 months earlier for the crime of asking a standard dietary question, was offered her original route back, along with a formal written correction added to her permanent file. She hadn't asked for any of it and hadn't even known, until she was personally contacted, that anyone had ever gone back and actually looked at what had happened to her. Caleb never mentioned any of it publicly. There was no press release about the incident, no carefully staged interview where he told the story of the CEO on the plane, no LinkedIn post about culture and accountability. He didn't need the story to be known in order for it to genuinely matter to him. The entire point, as far as he was concerned, had never been about being recognized or credited for fixing something. It had only ever been about actually fixing it. He kept flying commercial in whatever seat happened to be available on any given day, in the same plain, slightly wrinkled shirts, without an assistant, without any of the usual signals that might have told a stranger seated beside him exactly who he was. A few months later, on a completely different flight, a different passenger made a quiet, dismissive comment about the man seated beside her, the kind of comment specifically calibrated to be overheard without ever being quite loud enough to answer directly. A flight attendant walking the aisle heard it, made a brief note on her service tablet without breaking her stride even slightly, and continued on with the rest of her service, not with any visible anxiety, not with the practiced nervousness of someone genuinely worried about repercussions for speaking up, but with the calm, unhurried efficiency of someone who now understood, with total confidence, that the note she just made would actually go somewhere real. and would actually matter to someone with the authority to do something about it. Caleb noticed all of it from 3 rows back. He didn't say anything at all. He simply watched, the way he always did on these ordinary, unannounced flights, and thought to himself that this small, entirely unremarkable moment, a flight attendant doing her job properly, without fear, without hesitation, was worth considerably more to him than any single earnings call or acquisition announcement had ever been in his entire career. He still keeps the memory of that first flight close, even now, not because of anything Grace Whitmore personally said to him on that particular Tuesday, but because of exactly what it revealed about the company he owned and was ultimately responsible for. Status and money can make a person feel entirely untouchable for a very long time, sometimes for an entire career, sometimes for the better part of a decade, before anyone with the actual standing to say otherwise finally does. But the real measure of who a person is has never really been about how they treat someone they assume holds power over them. It has always been about how they treat the ordinary stranger sitting quietly beside them, in a plain, wrinkled shirt, when they are certain, completely, comfortably certain, that the person beside them has none at all.